Hello everyone and welcome to this video, which is in our Reengineering the Chess Classics series. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler and we're carrying on with the games of the great Italian player Sergio Mariotti, the Italian Fury. And this is one of his most famous games. It's a fantastic win against Viktor Kortchnoi, who was at the peak of his powers still in 1982. Well, you can say that for pretty much every period from about 1965 to, 2010 somehow. An amazing career. But here Mariotti defeats Kortchnoi in absolutely stunning fashion. Really nice game. With a very interesting opening as well. So let's have a look how that all started. We'll go right to the top. e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, and then g3. So this has been fairly popular at various times. White players looking for something slightly different to do against 1e4, e5. White's idea here is just to play bishop g2, knight e2, and you can follow up with d3, and then a sort of a kingside push, or you can just play d4 at some stage. Just sets black some fresh problems. Interestingly enough, I mean, d5 is a very natural way of dealing with it. It's been recommended in quite a few opening books. But the engines, at least Torch and Stockfish, they weren't interested in that at all. They all wanted to play the move bishop c5, which is quite decent, looking at that f2 pawn. And then you follow up later, maybe with c6 and d5. But Kortchnoi played another, also a very reasonable move, played the move bishop b4. So just hitting the knight on c3, the bishop comes to g2 to defend e4. Castles, knight e2, and then c6. So it's pretty similar to what Stockfish and Torch wanted, but with the bishop on b4 rather than c5. And here Mariotti castled. Actually, the engines quite like throwing in the move a3 in this position, just to chase the bishop back to a5. I mean, the basic point is that if we get something like in the game, then having the the bishop on a5 rather than on b4 means the bishop can't return ever to e7 or f8, for example. Might give white some extra possibilities. It's not a huge thing, but that's just what the engine's like. But castles played and Kortchnoi played d5. And now Mariotti reacted with a nice idea. Takes, and then d4. So basically, it looks like we're going to end up with some sort of IQP position where, white's got a bishop on g2 attacking the pawn on d5. It's nothing huge for white, but it's an unusual position. Black forced to think for himself. And of course for Mariotti, who was an amateur for quite a few years at this time, not really getting into any opening theory, but staying out of it against somebody who's already played it for 2 world championships. That's not a bad idea at all. So after e takes d4, knight takes d4. And Kortchnoi took a pretty rigorous decision here. I mean, knight c6 is it would be a natural move, waiting to see a little bit what white does. But what Kortchnoi did was very interesting. He took on c3, b takes c3, and now knight c6 would be quite natural as well. But Kortchnoi went knight b d7, and what Kortchnoi is aiming for here is to play knight b6 and just clamp down on this c4 square. I mean, this is the way that that Viktor always played. I mean, he tried to create imbalances against every player with both colours, and was always looking for chances, chances for a win. Basically, always wanted to keep that option open of being able to play for a win. And now quite an interesting moment. Mariotti played bishop f4, which is pretty logical, really. I mean, black's swapped off the dark squared bishop, obviously created those weaknesses, but also weakened some dark squares in black's position. So Mariotti actually takes aim very, very quickly with bishop f4 and then knight b5 on subsequent moves. What the engine's like here, and it also feels quite logical, is just to play the move c4 first of all. And so you're just going to try and open that diagonal, turn it into a sort of a Catalan bishop, cutting across the black position. And if d takes c4, then knight b5. And this is actually really awkward for black. I mean, we've got possibilities of bishop a3 hitting the rook, and also bishop f4, with a later knight c7. And the engine's, giving white, something like +1 or something, or even a little bit more somehow. They think this is a really powerful position. They actually feel that black should play the move knight e5 and not take her on d5 like that. C takes d5, rook e8, and then later try and get hold of that d5 pawn. But yeah, white's got a pretty comfortable advantage there. After bishop f4, it gives black the opportunity to play knight b6 and kind of solidify the position. So yeah, I mean, it's not my favourite thing in the world, what Kortchnoi has done, giving up the two bishops, weakening some squares. It's not the way that I used to play, but it's a perfectly good way of playing when you're trying to unbalance the position. And now that the knight has got a grip of c4, that white doesn't have that pawn break anymore, then black's doing fine again. Yeah, I mean, obviously in this period, the first thing we're looking at is pushing the rook's pawn. So yeah, a4 to a5 would be something pretty interesting to do, I think. Also got moves like rook e1, for example. Mariotti played the very aggressive knight b5, just aiming for c7, for d6, and kind of asking black, well, what are you going to do then? It's quite a provocative move, really. And Viktor played the move bishop f5 in response. So yeah, basically trying to say, oh, you had your knight on d4. Well, I'm going to put my bishop on f5 just to show that knight shouldn't have moved away. I mean, I was looking more at bishop g4. That felt like the most natural. I mean, you hit the queen. If white goes f3, then this bishop is blocked in, and you're just going to get a tempo somewhere to play a move like rook c8, for example. Yeah, I mean, that would have been quite decent as well. It's actually the engine's favourite idea. But bishop f5 is also pretty decent. Yeah, the interesting thing here is that Mariotti just keeps on going here. No fear at all. No sort of, got to watch out against Viktor, keep the position tight. He just, really did what he felt was best, and yeah, it's pretty challenging what he comes up with. A4 would be also possible. Just again looking for a5, hitting that knight on b6, trying to destabilize the black position a bit. But knight d6 is also a pretty good way of doing it with the pieces. And you're hitting the bishop on f5, you're hitting the pawn on b7, and you're also kind of supporting c4 as well. So, if black does nothing at all, we'll just blast open the center like that. Viktor played a move that really surprised me, but the engines say, yeah, absolutely the best. Almost reaching equality here. Just bishop e4, and yeah, I mean, the point is really, I suppose, that if white takes off this bishop with knight on e4, you've wasted a lot of time with this knight doing that. And yeah, black can take off with the knight or with the pawn and still have the nice c4 square for the knight and the pawns to attack. And there's no real danger for black there. So what Mariotti did, I mean, knight takes b7, we just go queen c8, and then we'll end up picking up the c3 pawn afterwards. So Mariotti plays a very nice move, bishop h3. Yeah, I mean, you see this in some lines. The Queen's Indian in particular, bishop is played to e4, and then you just sidestep it. But it's very nice somehow, this move. It's not an advantage or anything, but, it stops the rook coming to c8. It's still threatening knight on b7, still got some ideas like c4, and you've also got the idea of playing f3, driving that bishop away, and yeah, maybe just shutting it out somehow on the king side there. So very nice idea. But Kortchnoi reacts really well, actually. I mean, I have to say I was quite surprised by some of the moves that were being played by both players, but the engines like them a lot. So yeah, just goes to show, it's yeah, players of this era, they also knew what they were doing, Knight c4 played by Viktor, so challenging that knight on d6, and just not afraid at all of knight takes e4. I mean, knight takes c4 is possible. I mean, you get rid of this c4 square, but the bishop's got a very nice post on e4, attacking c2, and yeah, also stopping the bishop, this bishop from getting to the long diagonal. And c8 is not so important if the c file is closed somehow, so controlling c8 not so important. So knight takes c4 from Mariotti is by far the most natural move. Take the two bishops and then see where you're going. D takes e4 was, I found, kind of interesting somehow, and actually it's what the engines want. I just liked it because, this pawn blocks the bishop, blocks the long diagonal. You've no longer got that isolated d pawn to worry about, and you get the d5 square for the knight. I thought that this would be quite nice somehow for black, and yeah, it's what the engines like. I mean, they were looking at stuff like takes, rook d1, h6, just to stop bishop g5. Bishop f1, and now actually a little bit what Viktor did, but just better version really. The knight coming to a3 just to attack this guy, and you're going to bring a rook to c8 afterwards and attack the c3 pawn. White's got the two bishops, so always compensation, but this would have been quite decent. However, there's nothing wrong with Viktor's move, which is knight takes c4. I mean, I guess Viktor was kind of thinking, well, let's keep the queens on and keep as much play as possible in the position. And yeah, Viktor was very fond of grabbing pawns, and I'm sure he sort of felt, well, this c3 pawn, I'm going to get very close to munching it somehow. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe against Mariotti, it would have been more sensible to take the queens off somehow. I think that might have been a better choice because, yeah, this guy knows what to do with his queen and all his other pieces as well. So queen d4, just defending the pawn on c3 and preparing to, maybe line up on d5. Queen a5 from Viktor, looking at that pawn on c3, and now the move rook fe1. Pretty good move, this one. I mean, if queen c3, we can just go rook takes c4. So we're dealing with that threat. And, well, moves like knight takes c3. Yeah, I mean, we've got stuff, for example, like rook e7. And there's going to start being threats somehow against the king side here, because it's one of those situations, a bit like the game against Polugiewski that we saw, where somehow Mariotti seems to have this skill in letting the opponent's pieces drift away from their king, and yeah, I mean, this can be pretty dangerous somehow. For the moment, Viktor's a little bit more cautious. He played the move rook a e8. I was watching the video where that I mentioned yesterday on, I think it's Gambito Club, I think it's called, on YouTube. Look it up. I think I put the link in the comments. But he said this was a slightly odd move. I think I understood the Italian, and I mean, I think it's certainly true. It's a bit strange. I mean, rook e8 does feel more natural. Keeping the option of playing this rook to d8 to defend the pawn, or maybe even to c8 if this bishop moves away. But it's not terrible. I mean, it keeps everything tight at the back, and yeah, maybe gives black some possibilities of playing a move like f5, for example. Not quite sure what Viktor was aiming for, but it's a little bit strange, but it's not so bad somehow. Bishop f1 played by Mariotti. Again, took me slightly by surprise, but it's a very nice switchback. In particular, this rook has played to e8, so if it wants to go back to c8, that's going to waste a tempo. So it's always very nice to play a move like bishop f1 and sort of say to the opponent, haha, you didn't see that one coming, and now if you want to play your rook to c8, it's going to annoy you slightly because you will have lost a tempo. But Viktor reacted very, very ambitiously. He played the move knight a3, but we see, what we were talking about, this movement away from the king, the pieces, and the king's just being left to defend for itself. So the engines actually want the move queen b6, but that would be kind of, putting on the brakes just a little bit. You just want to exchange off the queens, and just say that with your two strong knights here, you're doing fine. For example, something like h4, for example, queen takes d4. This is a torch against stockfish game. The knight comes to c3 here, and yeah, you can't really drive these knights away very easily, and they're controlling lots of squares, so black's doing absolutely fine here. But knight a3 played, and now bishop d3. Now, well, this bishop is pointing towards here now, and of course we're going to have f3 to drive away the knight there. So although the engines feel that the position is still equal, I'm starting to feel nervous as black. I'm starting to feel that I'm misplacing my pieces a little bit. One important thing that might happen is that if the knight gets driven away, this bishop might have a very unpleasant square on d6 here. So rook e6 was played by Kortchnoi, and but Mariotti strikes back straight away, f3. Knight's got to move away, so it goes to c5. But again, we're moving away from the king side here. Yeah, I mean we're fighting for some squares. We're trying to cause some damage, but yeah, I mean it's getting rather nerve-wracking. And after this move, bishop f5, yeah, Kortchnoi's got a little bit of a dilemma here. I mean the d5 pawn is hanging, although c3 will hang in return. But yeah, I mean this bishop's attacking this pawn. This bishop is not so far away from joining in to attack g7. And what are you going to do with this rook? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure as well that Viktor was probably starting to run a little bit short of time as well. He chose the move rook f6, which is the most natural human move, or instinctive move, I think. You sort of say, well, white's going to take on d5, most likely with a queen. I'm going to take on c3. Let's make sure that we're attacking something to restrict white's options as much as possible. But yeah, what it's actually doing, it's putting the rook on a very exposed tactical square. And it's also leaving the knight on c5 unprotected, which, restricts the movement of the black queen. The engines like the move rook c6, and after queen d5, queen c3, they think that black's, equal. But of course, it's a bit of an uncomfortable hanging on. The engines are throwing in this little repetition. Of course, rook d5 allows rook e8 check. So that's why, yeah, rook f8 is being played. And now rook d1. And, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the engines can hold this, but, I don't like this at all for black. I just, it's very easy to drop a piece somewhere, and all sorts of endings, if you look to exchange off the queens, for example, well, white with the two bishops, always going to feel really comfortable. So, yeah, I mean, I think, you can really say that Kortchnoi has already made it rather risky for a human player anyway. And unfortunately, he keeps on, he makes this mistake with rook f6. Queen takes c3, rook d1. And the engines are putting the position at 3.53 now. It's that good for white. Now, the key point was, the key idea of playing rook f6 was that bishop e5 isn't possible because of rook f5. And if takes, then rook takes d5, and black's won a piece. But after rook d1, we are really threatening bishop e5, so because the queen is defended now. And well, there's not very much that that black can do, against that somehow. The engines are already getting quite desperate. I mean, if you go queen c4, we go bishop d6 here, takes, and yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of pieces in a lot of trouble there. So, the engine's already, despairing already. I mean, what Kortchnoi did, I'm sure he suddenly, it was only really here that I think he must have realized that things were really, really bad. He took on f5, queen f5, and knight c2. And I was really impressed with Mariotti from here on, because you're playing Viktor, and you've got a great position. I mean, that much is clear. But yeah, I mean, he's fighting like a lunatic. This guy, of course, extremely strong, enormous fighting spirit. And well, there are threats. Queen f3, knight d4. Forking those two, all sorts of things that can happen. But Mariotti just doesn't sort of sit back, doesn't try and consolidate. He just goes directly for the kingside attack, exploiting the fact that, yeah, he somehow drew away all Kortchnoi's pieces from the kingside, and now he's going to exploit this. And so that was bishop e5, hitting the queen, queen c4, got to stay protecting this knight, of course. And then, boom, bishop g7. Very, very powerful indeed. So yeah, I mean, Kortchnoi should have played knight e1, bishop g7, bishop f8 rather, and then somewhere taken on f3 and taken on f8. This is the engine line. I think knight cd3, and then yeah, something happens, and then you take on f3 later. But yeah, sorry, I'm just pausing because I'm just suddenly spotting. The bishop c5 is what I've got for the engine line with all my engine games. Yeah, obviously, if you take on here, I take off, and then you you take on e1. So knight f3, queen f3, and then queen takes c5. I think that's transposing into a line that Mariotti showed on his channel. So Yeah, I mean that's fair enough. King f1, knight e5. And well, I mean, black's got a pawn for the exchange, but white's clearly better. I mean, the fact that the king is so open really, really helps, because it just means that black can't just roam free with the queen looking for perpetuals, because there's going to be lots of mating replies coming up there. So the engines were winning all of these games, but it would have been I think a tougher proposition to win that. But yeah, Viktor wanted to see it basically, and I have to say that the wins are not that obvious, and also how clear they are. But Mariotti does it absolutely beautifully. So Queen G5, King H8, and there's a couple of ways of playing. What Mariotti did was absolutely great. Rook D8. The engine's throwing in Queen E7 first and playing Rook D8. But there's a lot of transposition somehow, because you can take off and then give a check, and it just leads to kind of the same thing. So but Rook D8 is just very, very powerful here indeed. How do you deal with this? I mean, if you go takes, I just got check, king there, check. It's quite nice, really. I mean, you go King F8, and then I just give a check here, and then Rook E8. It's that simple, and all forced. Quite unusual, actually. I haven't seen too many tactics like that. So, I mean, Knight D7 was played by Viktor. I mean, if you played something like Knight E6, I'd just take on E6. So Knight D7 played, just trying to, delay delay white. Rook takes D7, so then you'd have a chance to play Knight E1. But now Rook E8 from Mariotti, and that's a very nice move. This looks really nice, doesn't it? I think Rook E4 was even the engine favourite, but it doesn't really matter. Rook E8 is really strong. So Queen D4 check was played by Viktor. King G2. And then Queen G7 here, trying to shore up the black king side. Rook on F8. Now a very nice move as well from Mariotti. Queen E7. I mean, just in a few moves, starting with this Bishop G7, you've just, the increase in activity of the major pieces is absolutely incredible there. So, yeah, I mean, what do you do about this? Viktor actually resigned in this position, I think. Did he really resign in this exact position, or did he go on a move? No, it seems like he resigned in this position. There's just nothing to be done. Rook F8 is being threatened, or even just Queen takes D7. The only move the engine suggests anywhere in this position is Knight E3 check. After which you play Queen E3. It delays the inevitable, but it doesn't solve anything at all. I thought this was a really nice game from Mariotti. I mean, yeah, you wouldn't guess somehow that his opponent is supposed to be much more illustrious somehow. Kortchnoi just gets pushed aside there, very, very strongly. I mean, very interesting opening from Mariotti. Very interesting strategy. I mean, these moves like a quick knight b5 to d6, bishop h3, setting black very unusual problems. And not easy ones either. Of course, you look at the engine, you just say, oh, it wasn't the very best or whatever. But I mean, at the board, these are tricky problems to solve. And what I particularly loved about it was, well, first of all, this theme, just like against Polyevsky, somehow all these enormously strong players, their pieces just end up drifting away from the king. It's don't know how how Mariotti manages to hypnotize them into doing that, but it happens again and again. And then, yeah, I mean, what I really liked was this finishing off, Bishop E5. So no pause, no taking a rest in the middle of the attack. Keep on going, and that's always the best way to play against strong players. Don't give them time to regroup somehow, because they'll find a way to hold on, and then keep on asking you difficult questions. If you can find a clear win like that, do it. And yeah, it requires some really good attacking talent, and this was quite beautiful, I have to say. This Rook D8 and then Rook E8 and then Queen E7, really makes a really very powerful impression. So there we are. That was a great game. I hope you enjoyed it too, and I hope you're enjoying this retrospective of Sergio Mariotti. Really extremely talented player, and as I mentioned before, a player of whom Tal said if he'd been born in Russia, he would have been world champion. And yeah, you see the play here as an amateur, against many of the world's top players, and not just making a draw or anything, but beating them in such a style as well. It really shows this was somebody with really exceptional chess talent. So I hope you're enjoying this. There's plenty more to come, so do stay tuned, and thanks very much for watching.